If you've spent more than a few minutes watching one of the hundreds of crime dramas on television in the United States, you're probably already at least somewhat familiar with the idea of criminal due process. You know the scene. The detectives have finally gathered the evidence and closed in on their suspects. They arrest him and read him his Miranda warning. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to speak to an attorney and to have an attorney present during any questioning. If you cannot afford a lawyer, one will be provided to you at government expense. There's also often a scene where the accused gets off on a technicality, frustrating the officer's attempt to bring them to justice. The judge throws out some key piece of evidence because it was improperly obtained, or a witness proves unreliable, or something else goes wrong for the prosecutors. But just how close is this fictionalized account to the truth? In today's video, we're going to examine the rights and protections afforded individuals accused of crimes in the United States. It's a fascinating topic, so let's get to it. But let's start with the basics. What exactly do we mean by due process in the first place? In the simplest terms, due process refers to the fundamental principles of fairness and procedural protections that individuals are entitled to in any legal proceeding, whether criminal or civil. Due process guarantees include the right to be provided notice of the charges, the opportunity to be heard in any proceedings and to have effective legal counsel, the right to an impartial decision-making process, and a prohibition against any arbitrary or discriminatory actions. Due process serves as a safeguard against arbitrary government actions and ensures that individuals are treated fairly and justly under the law, as well as ensuring that various procedural safeguards exist to protect individuals from arbitrary or unjust governmental actions that might deprive them of life, liberty, or property. In the context of the justice system, criminal due process focuses on the rights and procedural safeguards afforded to individuals accused of committing crimes, addressing the unique circumstances and considerations within criminal proceedings. In other words, while due process generally guarantees fair treatment and procedural safeguards in legal proceedings, criminal due process specifically expands the legal protections afforded defendants. Such expanded protections include a presumption of innocence. Criminal due process ensures that individuals are presumed innocent until proven guilty. This principle requires the prosecution to bear the burden of proving guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Criminal due process also includes the right to remain silent and protection against self-incrimination as stated in the Fifth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. And finally, criminal due process encompasses a variety of procedural rights, such as the right to a speedy and public trial, the right to confront witnesses, the right to an impartial jury, and protections against unlawful searches and seizures. Let's see how all this plays out in a hypothetical case. Our hypothetical case begins with the robbery of Maple Jewelry Store, when a masked individual with a handgun makes off with several thousands of dollars worth of jewelry and cash. The incident was captured by the store's surveillance cameras. Police begin their investigation by collecting evidence from the crime scene: fingerprints, DNA samples, statements from witnesses, and video footage from the store's cameras. They catch a break in their investigation and receive an anonymous tip identifying the individual suspect as John Doe, who has a record of committing similar armed robberies in the past. They arrive at Mr. Doe's house, search it, and find some of the stolen jewelry and a gun they believe was used in the crime. They arrest Mr. Doe and book him into custody at the local county jail. Sometime later, Mr. Doe is brought before a judge for his initial appearance, often called an arraignment, where his lawyer is present and the charges against him are formally presented and the judge sets bail. All of this occurs during the pretrial phase of the case. Sometime later, the formal trial process begins. Mr. Doe decides to have a jury trial, so the jury selection process begins, with the district attorney and the defense attorney each asking questions of potential jurors to assess their impartiality and suitability for the case. Later, the trial actually begins, with each side offering opening statements. Because they bear the burden of proof, the prosecutor goes first, outlining the evidence that the state will present against Mr. Doe. The defense then offers its opening statement, outlining its argument against the prosecution's case. The prosecution then presents its case, calling witnesses and presenting evidence of the case they're building. Evidence can be direct or circumstantial. Direct evidence provides clear and explicit proof of a fact without need for additional inference. Such evidence is usually based on first-hand observations or accounts or on physical evidence that directly links the person to a specific fact or circumstance. Examples of direct evidence in this case might include the surveillance video footage, eyewitness testimony that Mr. Doe robbed the jewelry store, or a confession offered by the defendant to the police during the investigation. Circumstantial evidence, which is sometimes called indirect evidence, does not directly prove a fact, but instead relies on inference or logical reasoning to establish the existence of a fact. It is evidence from which a fact can be inferred based on a series of circumstances, facts, or other events. It builds a chain of logical reasoning to support a conclusion or inference of a particular fact. Examples of circumstantial evidence in this case might include finding Mr. Doe's fingerprints or footprints at the crime scene, or finding the stolen jewelry in Mr. Doe's possession. While none of these facts establish that Mr. Doe was without a doubt the robber, they nevertheless can be used to support the logical deduction that he was likely present at the crime scene or involved in the burglary. As the prosecution offers its case, the defense has the opportunity to challenge it. They might, for example, challenge the testimony of witnesses during cross-examination, or they might seek to exclude particular pieces of evidence if they were improperly obtained. Once the prosecution completes its case, it rests, and the defense is afforded the opportunity to lay down its own argument. This might include offering its own witnesses or evidence to challenge the prosecution's case, and the prosecution is entitled to challenge the case presented by the defense through cross-examination. Once both sides have completed their cases, each side offers a closing argument in which they summarize the evidence and arguments presented at the trial in a manner intended to encourage the jury to reach a verdict in their favor. After both sides have concluded, the jury deliberates in an effort to reach a unanimous verdict as to whether or not they believe beyond a reasonable doubt that John Doe committed the robbery. Normally, one of three outcomes is possible here. First, the jury might reach a unanimous decision that Mr. Doe is guilty, believing beyond a reasonable doubt that he committed the crime. Alternatively, the jury might find him not guilty. Note that in the U.S. legal system, this does not necessarily mean the jury believes he is innocent. While this might be the case, it might also be the case that the jury just believes there is not sufficient evidence to conclude that Mr. Doe was guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Finally, the jury may also be split, unable to reach a unanimous conclusion of either guilty or not guilty. This is often referred to as a hung or deadlock jury and results in a mistrial. Essentially, this means that the prosecution must decide whether or not to try the case over again. If the defendant is found not guilty, they're released, but if the verdict is guilty, a separate sentencing phase takes place. The judge considers factors such as the severity of the crime, the defendant's criminal history, and any mitigating or aggravating circumstances to determine an appropriate sentence. In some jurisdictions, victims of the crime are allowed to make a statement to the court before the defendant is sentenced. The exact scope of the sentence is usually outlined in broad terms by the criminal code. For example, if John Doe were convicted of armed robbery in California, the state's criminal code would specify a sentence of not more than 9 years and a fine up to $10,000. Sentences may not always include jail time, and courts may instead use probation, victim restitution, community service, mandatory treatment or counseling programs, diversionary programs to drug or mental health courts, or suspended sentences as alternative forms of punishment, particularly in nonviolent crimes. In any case, the defendant retains the right to appeal the verdict, requesting a change in punishment or an entirely new trial from a higher court. And all along the way, a variety of due process protections exist to ensure the process is fair and the rights of the accused are protected. During the investigation, Fourth Amendment protections provide safeguards against unreasonable searches and seizures, requiring law enforcement to have probable cause or obtain a warrant to conduct searches, seize evidence, or make an arrest. At the point of arrest, they are required to inform the defendant of their Miranda rights, including the right to remain silent and the right to an attorney. Failing to comply with the warrant requirement can result in evidence being excluded from the trial or even having the case dismissed, even if the defendant would likely have been found guilty anyway. And at the arraignment or the initial phase of the appearance, the defendant is informed of any charges against them and are given the opportunity to retain legal counsel. In most cases, bail is offered at this point, permitting the defendant to offer some form of collateral to be released from jail. The Eighth Amendment protects against excessive bail. During the trial phase, a number of key due process rights exist, including the Sixth Amendment right to legal counsel, speedy trial, and the right to trial by jury. The presumption of innocence until being found guilty beyond a reasonable doubt is protected by the Fifth and 14th Amendments. The Fifth Amendment provides protection against self-incrimination, while the right to confront witnesses against you is provided under the Sixth Amendment. Brady disclosure rules require the state share potentially exculpatory evidence with the defense. And Fifth and 14th Amendment protections provide for due process of law and ensure that the defendant is provided a fair and impartial trial with notice of charges against them and the opportunity to present a defense. Finally, during the post-trial phase, 8th Amendment protections prohibit cruel and unusual punishment and require a sentence be proportionate to the crimes committed. The defendant also has the right to appeal conviction or sentencing if there are grounds for legal error or constitutional violations during the process. And if the defendant is found not guilty, Fifth Amendment protections against double jeopardy or being tried for the same crime twice prevent the state from trying the case more than once. Now, the hypothetical case we've presented here obscures a couple of important facts. First, around 90% of all criminal cases in the United States never go to trial, but are instead concluded through a plea bargain. A plea bargain is essentially an agreement between the prosecution and defense in a criminal case that resolves the case without going to trial. Most plea bargains involve the defendant pleading guilty or no contest to one or more charges in exchange for concessions from the prosecution, such as a reduced sentence, dropping additional charges, reducing charges, or recommending a specific sentence to the judge. Proponents of the plea bargain system argue that plea bargains help expedite the judicial process and the resolution of cases, avoiding lengthy and expensive trials and reducing the burden on the court system. In other words, they argue it provides for a more predictable outcome that allows for efficient allocation of resources. It also helps avoid uncertain outcomes at trial. Defendants can mitigate the risk of being found guilty and sentenced to a more severe term, while prosecutors can avoid the risk of a not guilty verdict or a hung jury. But the plea system also has a number of critics who argue that the use of plea bargains can lead to potentially coerced or unfair outcomes. In some cases, they argue defendants may be pressured to accept a plea bargain due to the fear of a harsher penalty if they go to trial, even if they believe they're innocent. Plea bargains also require defendants to waive certain constitutional rights, such as the right to trial by jury or the right to confront witnesses. This can limit the defendant's ability to present a robust defense and challenge the evidence against them. Plea bargains may also undermine the truth-seeking process. By bypassing a trial, plea bargains may prevent the full examination of the evidence, potentially leaving important facts undiscovered or untested. This can undermine the pursuit of justice and the potential discovery of the truth. And finally, plea bargains can also perpetuate disparities in the criminal justice system, as certain defendants may be more likely to receive favorable plea offers based on factors like race, socioeconomic status, or inadequate legal representation. And let's also consider the problem of inequality in the criminal justice system in a bit more detail. Such inequalities operate along both racial and class-based lines, manifesting themselves across all stages of the criminal justice process and reflected in the disproportionate impacts on different groups. We see this reflected most clearly in the difference between the total population and imprisoned population in the United States. In the broadest term, relative to their total percentage of the U.S. population, white people are underrepresented in prisons, while Black, Native, and Latino people are overrepresented. Based on data from the Census Bureau, in 2019, white people comprised about 60% of the U.S. population, but only about 38% of the imprisoned population. Black people, on the other hand, comprised just 13% of the U.S. population, but 38% of the imprisoned population. Latinos comprised about 18% of the population, but were 21% of the imprisoned population. And Native Americans comprised less than 1% of the total U.S. population, but about 2% of the imprisoned population. This racialized inequality plays out at nearly every stage of the criminal justice process. Racial profiling means that minority communities, particularly Black and Hispanic individuals, often experience higher rates of profiling and discriminatory practices by law enforcement, leading to higher arrest rates. Such neighborhoods are subject to more aggressive and more frequent policing, resulting in an overrepresentation of arrests and criminal charges. At the charging and prosecution phase, prosecutors have discretion in charging, which can contribute to racial disparities. Indeed, multiple studies have shown that minority defendants may face more serious charges, leading to harsher sentences. Socioeconomic inequality can also influence plea bargain outcomes, as individuals with limited resources may face pressure to accept unfavorable plea deals due to inadequate legal representation or fear of harsher consequences if they go to trial. And at the sentencing stage, minimum sentencing laws coupled with drug policies have disproportionately affected minority communities, leading to lengthy sentences for nonviolent offenses. As one oft-cited example demonstrates, until very recently, the penalties for the possession of powder cocaine, which was more widely used among wealthier and whiter communities, was far more lenient than the penalties for possession of crack cocaine, which was more commonly found in poorer minority communities. And more broadly, a number of studies have shown that people of color tend to receive harsher punishments compared to white counterparts for similar offenses. And then once released, formerly incarcerated individuals face a variety of barriers to reintegration into society, including obstacles in accessing employment, housing, education, and other opportunities, exacerbating socioeconomic disparities, and increasing the likelihood of recidivism. So why does all this matter? The importance of criminal due process cannot be overstated. And while we often become frustrated with the slow pace of justice, it's important to remember that due process protections serve crucial functions in a democratic society. First, criminal due process ensures that individuals are treated fairly and with dignity, safeguarding their constitutional rights even in the face of criminal accusations. By providing a comprehensive framework for fair trials, criminal due process also helps protect innocent individuals from being wrongly convicted or punished for crimes they didn't commit. Third, criminal justice systems that adhere to due process principles enhance public trust and confidence in the fairness and integrity of the legal system. Additionally, by imposing checks and balances on the action of law enforcement and prosecutors, criminal due process acts as a deterrent against governmental abuse of power and helps ensure government accountability. And finally, criminal due process is an essential element of upholding the rule of law, promoting a just and democratic society governed by principles of fairness, equality, and justice. But despite its importance, there are a number of debates over reforming the criminal due process system in the U.S. today. We've previously touched on the problem of racial inequality in the criminal justice system, which remains a major focus of criminal justice reform. To that end, we might also consider the question of cash bail, which has also received considerable attention in recent years. Put simply, bail is a financial guarantee that defendants provide to secure their release from jail while awaiting trial. For its proponents, the bail system ensures that individuals need not wait in custody during the time leading up to their trial, freeing space and reducing the cost of pretrial confinement. But critics of the bail system argue that the system essentially criminalizes poverty because wealthier individuals can secure their release while those without the means to pay are effectively punished because of their poverty. Further, a number of studies show that individuals who remain in jail due to the inability to pay bail are convicted at substantially higher rates than those who get out on bail during their trial. Finally, the ability to pay bail often overlaps with race, further exacerbating racialized inequalities in the criminal justice system. As a result, a number of jurisdictions in the United States are exploring alternatives to cash bail. Recent technological changes have also impacted due process rights. Electronic surveillance, for example, has become more widespread, forcing the courts to determine where the line between public and private activity, or where a warrant is needed and where one is not, lies. These debates are likely to intensify as advances in facial recognition, biometrics, and artificial intelligence further push these boundaries. But that's it for now. Please leave any questions you have in the comment section below, and thanks for watching.